Okay, guys, welcome to my topic of today's talk, which is our brain filtering the universal field of consciousness. Don't worry, I will get more specific about what that means in the slides. Your sense of self-concept, meaning who you are, the philosophy of Purnam, and our concept of zero, both numerically and philosophically. So I'm just providing a little mini glossary for today's talk of topics I'm going to touch on throughout the slides. So first, when I say UFC throughout, I just mean universal field of consciousness. When I say Purnam, it is the Hindu and Buddhist philosophy of the concept of infinity. And I will bring up fractals, which are basically a never-ending pattern. They are infinitely complex that are self-similar. So meaning when you keep zooming in or zooming out, they will reflect the same look and behavior. So kind of building upon the last talk and recapping, so I was sort of challenging this idea that our brains generate their own form of consciousness. I believe it's called the OR theory, something with microtubules. But for me, I actually think that it's filtering this universal field of consciousness. And in tantric philosophy, this thing is called Brahman, the supreme reality, like everything with consciousness that ever can exist as like one entity, and we are all some dimension or some part of it, and our brain is just filtering information from that at any point, which can explain our evolution, our mindset shifts, our own changes that we experience throughout our lives. And the other aspect is building upon the theory that consciousness is a legitimate layer of our universe. The reason I say this is because when we think about our reality today, it is purely physical, all astrophysical, quantum reality related phenomena, which has led us very far in society and helped us evolve scientifically so much. So we love science and tech out here, but also there is a layer of inner experience that we tend to ignore because it ends up becoming too complex. And I would almost argue that if something is perceivable and broken downable, I guess, by human perception, then it probably is doing injustice to the complexity of that nature. So consciousness is something that has so much dimension and so much multiplicity. So this second bullet point also falls under like panpsychism, this idea that everything has consciousness, but not in the way that we call consciousness, because we tend to have a sense of an origin point of this is what it's supposed to look like, how it's supposed to sound, how it's supposed to count and remember. And so building on this idea also is from tantric philosophy, with this idea that Shiv is the experiential, unmanifest consciousness layer, and Shakti is more of that thermodynamics, physical manifestation, physical expression, the world and the reality that we interact with. But they're actually two sides of the same exact coin, and it's really important to acknowledge both, not just one. So in that talk, we also talked about moving from the micro to the macro scale, like all the way down to like atoms and molecules to galactic systems, and try to like pin them with like legitimacy metrics. Like, can we say that while these things are also physical, there is a level of consciousness to them? And what makes that legitimacy metric? So I kind of broke it down into four parts of efficacy and frequency, like is everything experiencing it all the time? Replicability and measurability, which we put like a question mark on because that is what I want my research to be focused on. Dynamism, does it follow the tantric philosophy movement of creation, preservation, and destruction, like this oscillation? And interactability and scalability, like are elements within this consciousness layer able to interact with any and all other elements at a small and a super large scale. So that was kind of the recap from the last talk, but the main idea was the first bullet point, that we are filtering consciousness, and this talk is going to expand upon that. The brain filtering the universal field of consciousness. So this is called the Shiv layer, and it's accessible to all of its manifestations and its physical forms. You can almost think of it like an infinitely like large grid, and there's waves and things moving up and down, and they take different forms, and the matter ends up actually condensing. and the brain is just filtering instead of generating. So, what I like about this idea is that you have some ability to access not only the layer, but the infinite possibilities across this layer as well. So, this kind of lets you feel that you are not fixed to one way of being. There is a way to have an infinite version of you. There are multiple permutations and combinations of what can make you you. And I like to think and wonder about how much of that is a choice that we're making. Like, how do are we choosing our thoughts? Are we choosing our personality? How do we choose what gets filtered? Because depending on what kind of mental health struggles you may be going through, you may not feel like anything is really a choice. It leads you to wonder, who are you really? So, bringing filtering that field with our sense of self-concept and who we are, what makes you you? Like I first think of like my name, how I introduce myself, my family lineage comes with my last name. Is it the thoughts that I have? A lot of people attach themselves to the thoughts that they see and experience and think they are them. Is it our personality and what does that really mean to have a personality and how we show up when we socialize? Is it how we feel about things? Is it our physical looks? Like this is what we are? And when we're thinking about personality, where did it come from? Like our upbringing, our socialization, the media. Why do we have feelings about certain things? Why do certain things make us tick? Like you can almost think of it like going to a concert. I think about this all the time. Like music always follows things mathematically. So there is a level of harmony that must be maintained. Yet there are people who hate like country or EDM or rap or whatever, and so what is that thing that gives you that experiential kind of connection? So highlighting also on thoughts, let's break down what thoughts show up for us in our minds. So we have our types. First, we're going to start with conscious thought. About 5% of cognitive processing is with what we are actively aware of and what we feel or have the illusion that we can control in the present moment. So when you're focusing, decision making, reasoning, problem solving, taking a test, doing the laundry, whatever, that would be more of your conscious awareness. Going a layer deeper, about 5 to 10% of our cognitive processes will be subconscious thought. It is just below conscious awareness, but can influence our conscious layer in the middle. So it stores your beliefs, experiences, emotions. It's kind of like a little memory bank of something that you're not always accessing, but it manipulates the reality that you want to or you think you want to have access to. And if you are able to kind of trigger things or like really go deep into subconscious, you'll be able to find like where there's like narratives that are like a bit stuck. Unconscious, I just am kind of mind blown by the number. 85 to 90% of our thoughts are what we don't really actively access, not even at like a slightly deeper level. And they are more kind of like bodily regulations that happens throughout. And I think what I also want to point out is as you get deeper and deeper into the types of thoughts, there's like a level of subtlety that's also like almost exponentially increasing, because these deeply ingrained habits, like you could say that even for like how your cells behave, like your heart rate, like the rhythm and the patterns of your body, and how that connects to like the mind-body connection. But 85 to 90% are below of our cognitive processing is below the threshold of conscious awareness, and they're deeply, deeply stored within us. So you kind of you think about thoughts, and if you think that you are your thoughts, and that's like 5 to 10% of like what's going on in here, kind of like, the brain telling you that the brain is the smartest organ. It's like, so what's really the truth? When you ask yourself what makes you who you are, as per tantric philosophy, the answer is nothing. Nothing really makes you you. In fact, you actually do not exist. The concept of you is an illusion. I think a lot of people are already aware of the fact that ego is like saying, I am this, I am that. The I is that illusory separation between subject and object. But the truth is, there are so many layers that you could pick, whether it's personality, feelings, thoughts, looks. You have so many dimensions, and then you want to say even all of those all together, amalgamated, make you who you are. That also is false. So this is where I'm going to touch on what I had brought up in the first talk, and when I say there are layers upon layers of who we are, and when I say that concept of us is an illusion. So here are the Panchakoshas, and they're basically saying five sheets or layers to our core self being pure conscious awareness. And I want you to pay attention to the fact that each of these layers end in the word Maya, and Maya means illusion. And so I do a deeper dive of this in the first talk that I will direct into the chat board. But basically, you go from the most identifiable layer, your physical self, and life force is breath, your mental sheath is your thoughts, emotions, all of that stuff that we were discussing. And then it gets a little bit more subtler where there's almost like an ego dissolution. So then what will you say? And even when you get to the final layer, which is the bliss body, it still ends in Maya. And this idea of like, you can still acknowledge that you are not you in this individualized sense, but you still know you're human and you're operating in that way. Therefore, you are still in Maya. And I want to kind of draw attention to the caption as well. These layers are on top of your true essence, right? Like put on top, on top, on top. But we can also kind of change this for ourselves and therefore change our realities. They have the potential to be pulled off, and I want to do this type of thing justice in a completely separate talk on what it looks like, and it'll tie in with our final question of the talk of what does it mean to pull these layers off and look within and shift the things that we do or do not like. Going back to the slide, so all you are is just layers, all types of different layers in all types of dimensions in all the permutations and combinations they can show up in. You don't have a personality, and that's not to insult you. I think you guys are really great, even if I haven't met you yet. I'm just saying that your mind tells you that you have a particular personality and that you act a certain way. The true essence is pure consciousness. And you can think of pure consciousness as a self-illuminating light. Like when it's a completely dark room and a light turns on, you know exactly where to look because it is also self-illuminating. It tells you, hey, I'm here. And light throughout is the same. It's just like the container. It could be a particular lamp, it could be a lantern, it could be like, a torch, but that light looks a different way depending on the container that it's in. So, it just took the form of you and how you ended up being at birth and the evolution of what happened since. I put my girl Kim Possible here because her catchphrase is I can do anything. And there is so much truth and depth to that because you really can be anything. And it is something that the West's diagnostic approach to personality and learning about ourselves and getting really deep and intimate, almost sensual with our minds, our souls, and the way we process. It's not really revered or celebrated. It's not even given like a guide or a framework, but there is that access that's always readily available to us. And on the last bullet point, when I say like everything given to you at birth, like that could look like, your parents' DNA, it could look like where you were born and the environment, what food you were being fed, and its evolution since the evolution compounds on top of what's already there. And so the longer you live and the longer you go on and the longer you continue to view your evolution in this way, the harder it can kind of become, not impossible, but just kind of more difficult, right? Like to like pull back the layers of who you were um in your past because you're everything as you grow on is built upon everything you've known. And if you really want to shift that arrow of time, you need to kind of go back and do a lot of that untangling from the past, if you so choose. So, what is our favorite way to maintain our favorite you? Um, Relationships. The reason being, we like perpetuity. We want the promise of forever from something outside of just us. And we like to have like almost a mirror to ourselves. It's why we choose the kinds of friends that we do that reflect a piece of ourselves back to us and vice versa. But when they're around us and they can look at us and they communicate with us, then we know we've been existing and alive this whole time instead of just maybe kind of experiencing or like feeling like we're inside of like a mascot and like, the different ways people can like depersonalize and have like an existential crisis. and continuity. We want to be perceived in all versions of ourselves. Otherwise, we run the risk of feeling like things are fragmented. Did that really happen? Did that version of me exist? Who am I? Especially this point that I see a lot at the stage of life where I'm at, where like the people that you're in relationships with, a lot of them don't even oftentimes like each other, but because they've been together for so long and they've like been through this or been through that, like as in perceived your personality shifts, your mindsets, and all of that, there is that sense of evolution and someone being there to witness it. We want someone to bear witness that. And so, my kind of question for all of us to sort of think about is, would we be able to handle a Futurama scenario? And I think in the first episode, this guy just kind of gets into a completely new reality, like nothing from this past world enters this new one. And if that happened to us, like if we were disconnected from our family members, our friends, our current work environment, everything that we attach to our identity as we know ourselves today, we would likely crumble, understandably, because we are social creatures. But as much as we really love to say that we want to have this sense of multidimensionality, it also asks us to get really very uncomfortable. It asks us to let go of continuity and perpetuity because that temporal association, meaning like the time we have spent with things, is also an illusion and it is a chapter of a version of ourselves. So I guess like if you think about meeting like somebody new and like having a brand new environment like every year, they would have only known you in that year. And then they never see you again. Does that make you any less you? How do you identify yourself? Do you have that sense? And this is what I mean when I say like we don't have that encouragement to understand ourselves from the centeredness of ourselves, from the perception of who we are and what we like. Oftentimes we almost like merge consciousness, right? Like we want to understand ourselves from the lens of the people we keep around us. And of course, this could get very dangerous because if someone switches up on us or says something about us, about our personality, it's a really quick way to nuke our self-concept and our self-identity. So it is essential when you want to go down this path of like developing your consciousness and becoming enlightened. You will move so much in this realm. So having an ironclad sense of self and grounding and being here is instrumental. So I have brought up the term the brain filtering the infinite field of consciousness, but there's a few schools of thoughts we can talk about. So people say that the infinite actually lives within you, that you are source. They say that you are the infinite. But I just said our brain is filtering something infinite, and we're human. To be human is to be finite, unless you guys are also like the universe continuously expanding. How can something human, which is contained, which is finite, hold something infinite? So which one is it? Either we're infinite from within, we don't need to grab anything else because it's all right here, or we're finite entities that get our life paths, our consciousness from something infinitely conscious and beyond us. Like it can't be both, right? But what if we did turn that or into an and? Meaning we say, not only are we infinite from within, and we are also finite, meaning contained entities that do get our consciousness, personalities, life paths, mindset shifts from something beyond us that is also an infinite field, that's infinitely conscious. So where does that lead us? And when I was thinking about this, I was like, how does this all work? I was reminded actually of my favorite mantra, and it stems from the philosophy of Purnam, which I said was the Hindu Buddhist philosophy around the concept of infinity. So there is this very lovely, my favorite all-time mantra that I would like to share with you guys. And once I say it, I will get into the definition, but I don't want to just kind of say it plain because I find that to be blasphemous. So I kind of want to just invite us to take a moment to close our eyes and maybe do like one or two deep breaths while I kind of just guide how this is meant to sound. So I'm gonna take a breath. I hope you join me. Om Purnamada Purnamudachyate Purnasya Purnamadaya Purnamevavashishyate. Om Shanti Shanti Shanti. Okay, now let's get into the definition of what this mantra means. What we are able to perceive is infinite. What we can't perceive is also infinite in nature. Just because of our inabilities doesn't mean that infinity in all of these realms does not exist. Out of the infinite being, where we're referencing Brahman here, the supreme reality, super consciousness, um, the finite comes, meaning manifestations, things that are contained, like even rocks. Yet they are infinite, and only infinite remains from them. And saying Om Shanti Shanti means peace, but peace in my heart with ourselves, with each other, and with our universe. So it's basically saying when you pull from the infinite, something may be contained in finite, but that is also infinite, and only infinite remains in all of this. So in maybe a little bit of simpler terms, what does that look like? Nested infinity, like going up and going down, constantly being infinite forever. Infinity going on for infinity. So this means we range from positive to negative infinity. So this is something I had to grapple with while I was making these slides. So I can understand positive infinity because that's something perceptible to the human mind where you're infinitely expanding forever and you get bigger and bigger and bigger. But with negative infinity, like I don't totally understand that because what I understand is like things get really small until you have absolutely nothing anymore. How do you infinitely go beyond nothingness when something hits zero? First, let's talk about nothingness or zero. So, what does it mean for something to be at the value of zero? It no longer exists. It can't be anything less than that because it's just not there. And then beyond zero, if we're looking at a number scale in the left direction, you have your negative numbers, and then on the right direction, you have your positive numbers. So what we can probably say about this is that it's like a man-made anchor point, an origin point from us, the perspective of human beings. But even with that being said, even if it's just an anchor point of something no longer existing, then when we think about things like -1 or -10, like negative temperatures, because it gets cold out here in this state, it shouldn't exist, right? Because to say something means to have the concept exist. And if it exists, it's not nothing, right? How can something less than zero technically exist, less than nothing exist? So let's reframe our understanding of zero. Is -1 to -10 still something? Yes, negative numbers are relative. They're all about relationships. They describe going into something beyond what you're supposed to. Again, there's like that origin point. So like zero doesn't mean the same thing all the time then. And or it means an inversion of a positive quality, like going in the positive direction of temperature is just hot, even though 0 degrees is pretty cold. And the negative is like super cold. Whoa, that's like beyond that point. I don't want that. And then even when we talk about like particles like electrons, it's, they have a negative charge because protons have a positive charge. So again, it's more of like a dynamical thing more than it being less than nothing. And it is just a way for human beings to measure and have metrics and compare things in the sense of being relative to one another. But, here are some examples where you can't have less than zero, right? Like there's everything in classical physics has mass. And you can't have negative kilograms of something. It doesn't exist. If you are asking your friend to come visit you and they're going like a negative distance, I really don't know where they would be going. That's not possible. And you can't have zero app or less than zero apples on a desk. You can only have zero, like no apples. So yeah, like previously the negatives were talking about like debt and relativistic states, and here it's actually more so talking about like absolutism. Beyond this point, you can't have this. So numerically, we see that zero is a midpoint. And just to give kind of a touch of what's kind of coming in future talks, zero in tantric philosophy is a field of infinite potential, the inception of everything. So in this talk, we're touching on Purnam, infinite, and the opposite of Purnam would be Shunya. Shunya is emptiness or like the true philosophical zero. But yeah, the midpoint reality was pretty strange to me while I was thinking about this because I was like, if we are scaling all the way up to down, how do we go from something really big and then like we stop, we go to nothingness, like zero, skip that, and then all of a sudden we have more stuff because if there's something in the negative direction, there's still something there. So I kind of am now wanting to look at zero purely as what it is, like a midpoint, and not even call it zero, just say midpoint. Okay, now coming back to our concept of nested infinity. So, recapping the mantra, what is visible and invisible is infinite. Out of the infinite, even being I meant to say yet being like finite, only infinite remains. No, actually, that's correct. My bad. But yes, the finite comes out. It's infinite in nature, meaning infinite only remains. So, we have nested infinity. We have infinity going on for infinity. The perfect example that we see of this is fractals. If you haven't heard of them, they are basically patterns that repeat forever, and no matter how much you zoom in or zoom out, they look pretty similar to the whole image. So here are some examples. Like with lightning, every branch you kind of like go off into, like the more you zoom in, the more it looks like the actual bolt of lightning itself just constantly going on and on. Same thing with bubbles and foams. Like one big bubble has all of the smaller ones around it, and the smaller ones have their smaller ones around it. Snowflake crystallization, leaves and their patterns, and some of the leaves even will resemble like the structure of lightning. So when moving from positive to negative infinity, there isn't a true zero or nothingness. There's no stoppage in between. You're just scaling. And for us to understand, we just say this is what's positive, this is what's negative. We are just viewing things like physically going from big to small. And touching back on what we talked about in the first or the previous talk, excuse me, in a consciousness sense, we're discussing how finite beings filter infinite consciousness. Well, we call ourselves finite um, while we are finite but call ourselves infinite. And also just wanting to touch base on the fact that we had gone over legitimacy metrics for consciousness existing at really small scales as well and big ones. So not only are things self-similar in a physical sense, but even in a consciousness sense, there is a way we're all similar to like, all the way down to molecules, all the way up to like big galaxies. So let's talk about the differences between the physical sense and the consciousness sense when it comes to infinity. In the last talk, we talked about how when things are really small in thermodynamics, and thermodynamics is just talking about the relationships of elements that have like heat and movement, and that comes from vibration, which is also the language that the layer of consciousness speaks. But coming back to thermodynamics, small systems are pretty like chaotic, disorderly. They seem very random and volatile. And one of the greatest questions in cosmology is why is it that larger systems move towards order, homeostasis, harmony? Where is that will or desire or evolution? If you don't want to personify, it doesn't really matter what word you use. It's just why does this phenomenon take place of organization and wanting to be stable and like live long? So, when we look at things from the human origin point and how our world operates, we would call that engineering, physics, like whatever technical understanding we can apply of the world from our perception, our limited perception, might I add. So, when we see how we want to calculate, we call that classical mechanics and physics. And then when we start getting really small, we see some strange behaviors. And that is, kind of the emergence of the field of quantum mechanics and quantum physics, and how things are a little bit more subtle and they don't behave like how we see things in our regular world. Now, we talked about in Tantra philosophy, like everything follows a creation, preservation, destruction, like oscillatory, if that's a word, nature from the macro to the micro. And that doesn't just mean the human version of macro and micro. These pieces of esoteric wisdom from these philosophies, they were talking about the entirety of reality, the entirety of the cosmos. So if Tantra is saying that we are all the same throughout all of these levels, then isn't it a little bit contradictory that we see that there is almost a shift, like once you get really small, instead of something being classical mechanics, it's quantum mechanics. Why is there a difference just because something got smaller? Why are we seeing things not be similar? Again, our definition of what similar is. Is there some sort of drop off where behavior changes based on scale? Is it a drop off or a lack of our ability? So, is there a shift that truly happens? Or and I was thinking maybe we're just as limited in our perception of consciousness, awareness, and measurement in the same way we're also limited with what we are able to see in the visible light spectrum. Is it possible that human beings have a perceivable consciousness spectrum? I'm talking even beyond unconscious, deep thought that, even if you could access, because if you're saying it exists in your mind, you still have some type of access. There's some involvement with you going on. Otherwise, it wouldn't be in your mind or a part of your cognitive process. But when pushed to our limits, like with the smartest people you would ever know, the most intuitive people you would ever know, is there a point beyond which you can't do calculations, you can't understand things because we are finite. As long as you have a container, you're finite. And we work with contained things like time, distance, our interactions, even our concept of self is really limited. We wouldn't call ourselves everything. If you self-describe, you're going to use a few adjectives, and then every few years, those adjectives will change. And so it's really up to like our mind and how we're able to handle information at a time. And so if we are finite and dealing with something infinite while also having infinite within us, then not only do we have a scaling issue, but also a processing issue. And I think it's really important that we try to be humble here and acknowledge that there's like a level beyond that, we can't always figure out and like try to have the perfect metric for in the exact way the West has um, put in their scientific method. So, what does it look like to go beyond human perception of consciousness at micro and macro scales? How does the universe show up? Why do we struggle to grasp how it works at really, really, really small or really, really, really big scales? And what does all of this have to do with your brain filtering an infinite field while you are also infinite from within? So remember we talked about zero being a midpoint, not really nothingness. So I guess everything that we look at outside of us, like it can always look bigger. You sit down, you look up at the stars, or you look at like any system like outside of you, your range of vision will allow you to see greater things. And then everything kind of more internal, it would be internal physically as well. You would need a microscope to like view you. That's why we have surgery. It's why we have the kind of medicine technology that we do to look internally at a physical layer, but we are talking about our consciousness and our perception of self-concept. So, in order to explore the infinite within you, you must be able to see yourself as that midpoint. that anything that I see beyond me is the thing that's infinitely expanding, and within me, it's like infinitely scaling inwards. And me being like zero doesn't mean I am nothing. It just means that I am the midpoint, I am the origin point that I can work with. So, philosophically, emotionally, in this call, we're talking about like looking for the infinite you, the multidimensional you. When you're looking for the infinite, what are your goals with that self-concept and understanding yourself? So it depends on what you are trying to achieve. There's a lot of reasons we try to look within and understand and self-reflect. Are you generally curious about all that's possible just for funsies? Are you trying to change some things going on in your external reality? And remember, for people that have been here since the first talk, the whole hypothesis is that the external cosmos are nothing but a projection of our internal consciousness, which is why we're even talking about this today. What else are you trying to do? Are you trying to escape the current version of you? Do you want to know who you are, what you are, when you are, where, why, what makes you who you are outside of like the definition you've even given for yourself? Um, and even in trying to achieve this, don't ask questions unless you're ready to get like a real answer because if you really can be anything at any time, and we took like the most hyperbolic example, like someone that was the total antithesis of you, maybe someone you hate, like an enemy you can think of right now, and you just hate everything about them, but you have the possibility to be them and they have the possibility to be you if you're filtering, and you can change your behavior at any time. You can change your mindset. There's ripples across this field of consciousness. Um, so would you be okay with that? Like, there's a degree to which we really want to change, and we have to sort of start asking ourselves questions at a deeper layer. What are we still sort of holding on to? And this is touched more on the first talk, but when I was talking about the Panchakoshas, the five layers, there is the bliss body at the very core. Right above that is the wisdom layer, also known as the observer layer. That's where your ego disillusion sort of begins, and you don't really identify with the thoughts that you have. And a lot of my understanding of reality-based disorders, which I've had actually three for like an 8 to 9 month period episode, and it was god awful. And a lot of it looks like kind of looking at these philosophies and thoughts, but I've only come here because of a lot of realization, where like the West is sort of like missing from, the Eastern philosophy that bring not only the multidimensionality of a consciousness layer, but compassion, love, and frameworks to build upon and work with so that you can understand and move through these emotions. Because oftentimes when we're thinking about who we are and what we are, it is circumstance. And a lot of times when people struggle with psychosis or some existential spiral that gets really, really, really out of whack, or this state of complete darkness, you could like, I have CPTSD, for example, and I've had trauma for like 20 something years. And it can impact the way that you're, living. And like I said, when we evolve, it's like what we have stacked upon top of each other. But it can also cause you to have a warped sense of reality. Like something happens in the home, and then you go out in the public and they treat you differently. It's like an entirely different world, and you don't really know what you are. And like, as you grow and change and move throughout different relationships with different people you meet, different careers that you have, like people really develop serious conditions like fragmented personality disorder is something I have not gotten, but I have read reports of people who have, and it's really terrifying because when things are so hyperbolic and strong in the different situations they're in, we are again not taught to understand ourselves and understand that technically we are just pure consciousness awareness. We're just kind of taught to work with the paradigms that other people sort of put upon us because that helps us be more convenient to them. That's not to say that thinking this way is inconvenient. I would almost argue it's more convenient because you can understand that change is something that happens, that not everything lasts entirely forever, and that with change you can evolve and grow, and it is a pathway to harmony. But if you're obdurate in sticking into one way of being, you will continue upon the division and the conflict you have in relationship to one another. So at the end of the day, this sort of deeper understanding, it starts with you and only you. There's tools and resources, obviously, that come in handy, but the last part of the journey of looking at what it means to be the infinite you comes from your choice of what you want to pick from that. And when I'm talking about tantric philosophy, that whole breakdown is touched upon in talk one. But essentially, these people, like these gurus and these monks, they really learned about the structure of our universe. And a lot of the times with these philosophies, you see mythologies, which are really just an accessible way to understand like mathematics, physics, quantum reality, because not everyone would have access to the same exact education back in the day. That doesn't mean that they are any less worthy of experiencing this. Like whether you understand how the sun works and solar flares work doesn't change the fact that it still affects the earth and you are still affected by it. So if that's going to happen anyways, and you're still going to experience it, might as well find a way to learn accessibly. And so tantrics actually looked completely within. There will be a separate talk on this, but working with yantras, like shapes that you see commonly that have fractals embedded into them, different geometric positioning, breath work, even with meditation, observing oscillations on the inside. They were able to actually learn a lot about the sun and the moon cycles. They were able to learn about star systems, and it's really incredible. I haven't met one, but it would be super lovely to get a deep dive on how they were able to get to that sort of knowledge. I'm very thankful that they have that sort of philosophy. So, as you can see, your internal consciousness is not something very separate from your external universe, which I think is so beautiful. Even if you feel like when you're trying to make a change in your life and you feel that you don't believe in yourself based on something other people have told you to almost like hold you back, maybe you can take comfort in the fact that you have no choice. Like it can only really start with you. There's nothing outside of you externally that knows what's in here. And then at an internal level, like your heart can't make choices at like a physical level. Your cells can't really do that like at a holistic level. You want a personality shift, it will take your whole person. It'll have to start with this. This is your 0 point that you'll have to start with. And whatever that you're looking for, that is out there to a degree, foundationally speaking, it's in here for always, ever, and for everyone. We all have access to this. It's just a matter of how can we access this. So we'll touch on access a little bit. Tantra's philosophy on nested infinity, and here are the deities for creation, preservation, and destruction. Everything is pulled from the infinite, and itself is infinite, and only infinite remains. And fractals are a great example of this concept because we're visual creatures. There's only a certain language like we understand, whether it's through speaking, seeing, smelling, whatever. We have five senses and they all have their own language that we understand. And so when we can see self-similarity in like lightning, we're like, oh, okay, like that makes sense. But nested infinity might not look self-similar in a traditional sense. And I say this to say because we have something different where we talk about classical mechanics versus quantum mechanics. And I get it. It's purely to talk about how like the physical behaviors show up. And it's important to have categorization and distinction. Totally on board with that. But if there is a shift, then that means there's not a similarity, but there's supposed to be similarity in a nested infinite situation. So what could it quote unquote look like? It's all about data. It's all about data. Like even down to like phonons and photons, the basic constituents of sound and light, they all carry packets of data, and memory and storage, and it reverberates throughout the cosmos, right? So the same cosmic laws of symmetry and entropy, they exist on infinite scales, but the manifestations can shift depending on the density of information and scale. That's an interesting thing to think about too. Like, what does it mean for information to be more dense? I would argue that we are super intelligent, super dense forms of information. But sometimes information looks really, really subtle. Like, if we know how wind is moving in a particular direction, that direction itself is a form of of information, but it doesn't look like something that carries information. You know what I mean? So this is what I mean when I talk about density of information. So, like humbly understanding that in between negative and positive infinity is the perceivable spectrum where our understanding resides and is limited. So, where is the gap of understanding? It's how data is represented at various scales. And so as we like have our scientific method today, there's like time limits we have, there's tools that we across the board in all of our classes use to measure how things will be and how they look with things that we have today. Super advanced stuff like at CERN, we're not really going to have access to. There's no need to do experimentation like that. So the data we work with is still very like limited and saturated with only our way of understanding how this data is encoded. So I don't have tools and pieces of proof like literally at these scales because it's not like this is sort of like greenfield stuff. So we haven't gotten entirely deep, I think, as a society with merging Eastern and Western philosophy and researching in this way, which is what makes this so exciting. But we can talk about some possibilities of how these things may show up. So accessing data at positive infinity, what does the data show up as? Scaling up of emergence. Emergence is basically a term that means a phenomenon that comes up due to a level of interdependence of a system. And interdependence or dependent origination is a core foundation of Buddhist philosophy. And what it means is everything exists in relation to something else. So, like, if I had like a grid network with like a bunch of little dots and nodes, and they're all connected to each other, like that, like looking like a grid. But if I like pick one out, then the ones surrounding it, they also kind of like fall apart because they were connected to that one. But then if these fall apart, then the ones that were closest to them, they also fall apart. So that's kind of like a visual of how you can think and conceptualize dependent origination. Like everything exists, anything that exists is not independent. An example would be a tree that grows from a seed planted in the soil, that is like giving cause and effect, and it's an isolated system. But truthfully, that seed, in order to be its seed, needed so many different factors to go into making that thing what it is. And even the process of the tree growing, it had to rely on not just the seed existing, but like the rain cycle, the soil, and people not cutting it down. And those are very simple examples, but I hope I'm able to get the message across when I say that, like, there's so much constantly interacting with us, and that's what we can perceive. Think about the things that we aren't able to use our five senses for that are constantly affecting us, each and every day. So emergence just means a property that emerges from everything being interconnected with each other. So at positive infinity, we see clusters with superclusters. They like the positive infinity is not that crazy in its behavior at a physical sense. Really, it's only in the time sense where things get a little bit fuzzy. But you start going towards like gravity being your primary force, and that is what shapes information and space-time curvature, which can get pretty gnarly. Time also becomes distorted by relativistic effects, and there's a way it behaves more cohesively, yes, but like in the latency that it interacts with us with, like it's happening separately on its own, but because we are trying to understand it, there's like a time distortion, there's a time delay, so it makes us hard for us to really understand the phenomena all by itself, which really adds on to the dependent origination that everything really is connected. You can't be aware of space-time curvature distorting unless you were there to observe that. Self-similar structures at vast scales. Yeah, and actually what's really cool too is there's like a video about like the universe is your mind of how like galactic filaments, they resemble our neural networks, but they have similar organizational principles. But as you can tell, it's really difficult to just kind of go out and measure these things on your own, unless there's something you guys aren't telling me about your ability to travel throughout space. But at positive infinity, encoding relies on networks, a lot of interconnectedness, gravity, space-time distortions, and emergent structures. Emergent structures too can be pretty hard to predict if you can't really even get to like the bigger structures themselves that are causing other structures to form. So a lot of it is like pretty generic estimation. So let's talk about what data can show up as in the negative infinity, like infinitely, constantly going at a smaller level. And also I like to think of it as the as it's not really getting smaller. I guess it's small to us. It's just something going on forever. You're just kind of like zooming in and out is also such a human thing to think about. So I have to like remind myself like everything I'm saying is from the perception of like human understanding. Anywho, so we get to a realm of extreme subtlety. We have quantum fields, probability waves, and with quantum reality and mechanics, it is information encoded as possibilities rather than definitive states. And it collapses when you observe what's going on. Temporal blurring. So at quantum levels, there's unique behavior. Time loses linearity. Causality becomes fuzzy because everything appears to be super duper random. And information encodes as relational patterns rather than events happening one after another. The arrow of time, is different from what we understand because for us, the only concept of having an arrow of time really comes from the concept of entropy, which is this idea that things are always breaking down and shifting in their material and matter. Like we know that, it's been like a week because if we put a dead body in front of us, not to be too dark, but like it's going to decay. And that broke down, it participated in entropy in the world. Therefore, we kind of have like, detectives can do an estimation of like this body's been here for this many days. Like, so they're able to understand that, but that kind of entropy breakdown exists in like that thermodynamics understanding of our universe, that physical understanding. When we go into the quantum realm, things look a little bit different. Especially with things like entanglement, which is really crazy to me. Yeah, where two particles seem to instantaneously share information. When something is positive here, instantly it's negative there. And I can't personally wrap my mind around it. I don't know about you guys, but like how did this one thing become, where was the choice in this thing being like a positive charge versus that thing being negative? Wouldn't that being negative depend on this thing being positive, which would mean sequential events, but that's just not how it works. It's instantaneous. And my human brain is like really getting humbled by trying to put these concepts together. But yeah, and energy is encoded as vibration. That's like the most common thing I think we hear a lot in the world, especially with spiritual culture is energy and vibration is really popular buzzwords, and they become carriers of encoded patterns. And, a thought might exist as a harmonic resonance in the universal field. When we were talking about things not having like negative mass in physics, I think for something to be considered matter, you need to have mass. And so is thought really like matter? Like, what is the concept of a thought? That's also interesting to think about because does that have a size? Like, and it doesn't have mass, but it is a process that takes place in our physical mind. And it could be an emergent phenomenon, or maybe it has mass and we just don't have the tools to be able to measure it yet and how it behaves. Because if we are filtering a universal field of consciousness and thoughts are kind of like moving in and out, what are those things that are able to move in and out? So it's just something interesting to think about. The self-organization of chaos. Yeah, I just think like this just reminds me of thinking of the mess on your chair of laundry that you are going to get to, you've been saying for months, but you know where your favorite jacket is. It's like in this layer. So like you have like organized chaos in your own way. But there is a lot of complexity that can exist too. It's just really tightly packed and difficult to understand. So like maybe something that has like good structure into it, like outside it looks super duper crazy. You would just have to be really good at getting like have like an infinite like microscope, which we don't have. Um, but yeah, like we think of molecular interactions creating life as being random at this atomic level, but yet it's able to create organizational things. So really leads you to wonder like how random some of this stuff really is. At negative infinity, encoding relies on probabilities, vibrations, and relational dynamics, where structure is emergent rather than fixed. And at the positive infinity direction, we were seeing a lot of like structure, um, definition, things molded to be a certain way. So clearly there's emergence at the smallest scale and structure at the largest, and they're all similar. And I really do feel like why it's so important to discuss the consciousness layer and what it means to have diversity in consciousness is that how our perception decides to approach something and look at something can kind of shape that reality. And I don't mean to say that in the sense that like when you like look at something, you're changing that door into like an apple or whatever, but it's this idea that like things can exist in a particular way. You really don't know what it is, but your interaction is what brings it to life. So as we can see, accessing at a smaller scale feels more accessible because if we think about like large, like heavenly bodies and those systems, there's just so much inefficiency, like spacesuits for one, but then the time to get there and the money and the fuel, right? But if we're trying to understand something out there, we can start with working with what we have internally. But as we saw that there's some, like organized chaos going on internally. Even like one of my friends who's studying immunology, she was talking about like how when viruses kind of come into our systems and our cells like hold memory of how to behave, like how is that memory there? How does it know how to act that way? And like you kind of stop it, sort you don't go into the hows and the whys like too much. It gets a little philosophical. It's also not really important when you're working with someone who's gotten sick. So we aren't really encouraged to think much beyond a particular point, and I get it. Like it doesn't maybe have like a real use, but for me, where I see the profound level of impact from understanding these systems, is that it can help with people who have and struggle with reality-based disorders. And one thing I forgot to add in the slides too is talking about dimensionality reduction. Because if we do have access to something infinite within ourselves and we are contained elements, then there is a way that data sort of gets compressed. And it almost makes me think about time being a form of dimensionality reduction. Like if we had access to all information, we're still thinking linearly. Like what if you have access to all information that happened ever, past, present, future? Again, arrow of time is a concept that only exists because of entropy in our physical world. But like I guess we would have access to everything all of the time. And so I think our minds are, contained. They can only handle so much, and they can only handle information one piece at a time. So it really makes me think about what reality would be like if you didn't have that level of dimensionality reduction. And I'm going to focus more on like what that looks like coding wise, modeling wise in a bit, but it was just something interesting to sort of bring up in this talk. So, where I feel like my edge is here is that if there is a bandwidth where human perception lies in consciousness awareness and the infinity scales, like there's a limit. And that's why I want to push for my research to infer it out, not figure it out. The moment you try to condense this material into human terms, you have lossy data. And I think there's just some things that we are going to have to accept that we will have to like have a general idea about and how its behavior interacts in probabilistic ways instead of trying to make it something fully structured and showing up in our reality as it is, because clearly that hasn't worked and we're being affected by things that we can't normally perceive with our five senses, things that we say that we can't explain, but they still make us feel emotions, they make us have a bad day, they make us have a negative experience. So This sort of wraps up my talk on talking about the brain filtering, the universal field of consciousness. I really appreciate everybody for tuning in, coming in, and listening. You can always leave deep, dark existential questions in the discussion board, give some feedback. I will always be monitoring it. And I'm making this a second career. I'm like working off of my savings and really focused on this research and wanting to help people with reality-based disorders. And so donations, if you're willing and able and you feel the desire, they help make this dream a reality. But yeah, I appreciate everybody listening. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.